Today's review is on the Gothic novel The Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice. This is the second installment in Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles. Lestat is our narrator in this book, and he begins telling us about his life as a mortal, living with his family, mother, father, and siblings, and the fact that he is very depressed living with his siblings, and he wants to escape. He wants to run away and try life somewhere else. Ultimately, he ends up escaping with his friend Nicholas, and they run away to the city of Paris and begin living their lives there. While in Paris, Nicholas and Lestat take up theater. And during these productions, these plays that they're putting on, Lestat begins to get an eerie feeling coming from the audience, and that eerie feeling is ultimately transmitted by the vampire Magnus, who is out looking for a mortal to pass his legacy on to. Magnus kidnaps Lestat and turns him into a vampire and commits suicide due to lunacy and leaves Lestat his castle, his great fortune, and a very brief instruction on what Lestat's now supposed to do now that he's become a vampire. Lestat was turned by Magnus, and Magnus was very powerful. He was more powerful than ordinary vampire, and that power is passed on to Lestat. Lestat then begins living his life as a vampire, and he has a hunger for truth. He doesn't know who he is now that he's a vampire. He doesn't have an identity. He wants to understand the history of the vampires so that he can get a better idea of who he is and what he's supposed to do while he lives his life. Lestat seeks out other vampires and finds the vampire Armand. And Armand gives Lestat kind of an impartial history of the vampires that is unsatisfactory to Lestat. Armand mentions the vampire Marius, and Lestat then seeks out the vampire Marius in an attempt to get a more complete understanding about what it is to be a vampire. Lestat ultimately finds Marius, and they have a dialogue. They talk about the history of the vampires, the first two vampires, and how those two vampires became vampires. I was very satisfied with Anne Rice's explanation about the first two vampires and how they came into being. That is the story that takes place in The Vampire Lestat. It is a biography about Lestat. It is a search for vampiric truth by the Vampire Lestat, and ultimately is a very good vampire novel in and of itself and as part of the series. I give this book 3 stars out of 5, primarily based upon the fact that this isn't something that I would normally read, if you will. There's not much suspense in this novel. It's more aimed at people that are into the vampire thing, if you will. As far as being a vampire novel, it's very good. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that Anne Rice has created the best vampire novels of any ever written. These are the holy grail of vampire novels. I give it 3 stars out of 5 because of the fact that there was not any suspense involved in this novel. I had to push towards the end of it to actually complete it. If you're into vampire novels and you haven't read this, I don't know what you're waiting for. I definitely recommend it. I say must read. If you're not particularly into vampire novels, I'm kind of on the fence. I'm not really sure if I would recommend it or not. I would say start with book 1, and if you're inspired by book 1, then read book 2. If you're into vampires, definitely must read. If you're not, I'm not really sure if I recommend it or not.